Greetings and welcome to Module 4 of New Literacies. So in the spirit of G, thought I'd give some shout outs to your work on his principles in your teaching and workspaces. They all looked great. A couple of quick highlights. Alicia's cork strip and the C3PO photobomb. That was great to see. Tabitha had a front and center approach in the bulletin board with the lion. The lion really draws the eyes to it. Raylan going audible, hanging up at home because of classroom maintenance. I've been there myself. Had to empty my classroom out once for an exterior wall removal in my first teaching job. Lisa's layout, the full wall setup, that was huge. That was great. Siobhan's very visual graphic wall, great to see it next to the diplomas as well. Rachel's location next to the info for the kiddos. It's just a few of your examples right there. Great to see. I hope those continue to work for you. Thought I'd show you a little something. It's rather thick. It is Handbook of Research on New Literacies and Lancashire Nobel editors. If you have an opportunity to get one of these used, if you're enjoying the material for this course, I highly recommend it. I had to lean on the publisher for an exam copy of this very heavily. But even just to look up the contents, this is 1,367 pages of New Literacies gold, treasure trove of ideas and theory. Great editors, as we all know. G is cited in here many times. And there's one article that's a chapter that's in here that he has a follow-up response to. It's called a contemporary response. Think of it kind of like a discussion within the handbook. Yeah, you guessed correctly. I wish this could have been the course textbook, but I figured the price and the fact that there's no way we could get through the whole thing in 5 weeks would probably make it a very unpopular choice. Nevertheless, if you have a chance to get a hold of one of those, I highly recommend it. Constant reminders, always be utilizing that A-State email address. I'll send my mass emails. Also monitor your email address very closely for AOS emails, further information as you'll be looking ahead to future terms, right? Make sure you're checking it daily. I check mine multiple times a day, not just for my own job, but for you as well. Keep that communication a two-way process, right? And with each week, make sure you're completing that BioSig ID authentication each week to make that module activities folder appear. It's especially important in this case because that folder will have the paper submission just like last week. Our academic assistant Katie and I, we are enjoying looking over your theoretical explorations, and we should have those grades posted very soon if they're not already. Make sure you examine and ponder that feedback. Reach out with questions, especially as you think about this work, possibly getting a few tweaks, adjustments as you move it forward toward your final symposium paper. Also, make sure that you are downloading and utilizing that template file in Microsoft Word .doc or .docx format. It's the required format stated in the course syllabus. You must use this template for both the practitioner project this week as well as the final symposium paper, of course. The distinction with that final symposium paper, though, remember, it's the candidate's responsibility to make any necessary adjustments to the template format in order to conform with the requirements of the state-level journal that you target. Speaking of which, our major milestone for the course this week is the submission of that practitioner project short paper by Sunday night, June 23rd, 11:59 p.m. end of day. The additional video this week, I'll have additional tips and suggestions for navigating that assignment, just like last week. Very similar format, very similar feel. And of course, the previous 2 weeks' additional videos will certainly come in handy. As you look forward to that final symposium paper at the end of the course, please feel free to reach out at any time for early draft feedback requests, informal, via email. And most of my courses, I have a posted set of rules and guidelines for early feedback to keep it from becoming too chaotic a process. In this case, since we have both a smaller number of students in this course, but also I have that desire to support your drafts and the evolution of your thinking as you work and revise in order to send it forward to that state level journal you've targeted, I want to make sure you have access to comfortable levels of feedback, right? But make sure to get those requests in early, and out of courtesy to Katie and myself, also, if you, and I'll mention this next week, if you have any further thoughts or questions, feedback requests once the course is over, especially if it involves getting something ready for that state level journal, I'm certainly available. I definitely want to be. But those requests, I have to balance those with the active requests for my Summer 2 courses that I will be in the process of teaching next month. So the take-home message is get those requests in as early as you can, allow as much time as you can. I'll do the best that I can. I'll talk about that more in next week's video, to additional video with Module 5. So we turn to G to bring a conclusion to our thoughts about G. Chapter 5, he jumps right in with clear points that context is everything when it comes to learning. On 113, he says, humans have a very hard time processing information for which they cannot supply such simulations. We also don't do well when left to our own devices, as he says. The dilemma then is this: for efficacious learning, it's a great word there, efficacy, right? Learning filled with efficacy. For efficacious learning, humans need overt information, but they have a hard time handling it. For G, video games balance overt learning and the context, or immersion in practice, you could think of it that way, very well. The Tomb Raider example, pages 114 to 124, it's kind of his own case study on himself, and this may be my favorite one from the text. I think he was really hot on the trail of it on this one. It may make the most sense of any of his principles in some ways on page 123 when he says, training modules and early episodes where fundamental learning gets done are built as simplified versions of the same work in which the player will live, play, and learn throughout the game. Learning is not started in a separate place outside the domain in which the learning is going to operate. At the same time, the learner is not thrown into the real thing, the full game, and left to swim or drown. Again, it's page 123. So how does this translate to our classrooms? And by the way, this is a great review of some G terminology. This is what is magical about learning in good video games, and in good classrooms too. Learners are not always overtly aware of the fact that they are learning, how much they are learning, or how difficult it is. Learners are embedded in a domain, a semiotic domain, like a branch of science or a good video game, where even when they are learning, and since the domain gets progressively harder, they are always learning. They are still in the domain, still a member of the team, affinity group, still actually playing the game, even if only a newbie. So some great reviews, semiotic domains, affinity groups, things like that, right? On page 124, transfer of prior knowledge with mixed innovation is the greater goal, of course, with this. He offers a great Castle Wolfenstein example that stretches page 124 to 129, which concludes with a great set of 4 very important types of active learning on page 129, and then as well as his System Shock 2 example on pages 129 to 134. Sorry about all the light behind me. We see his thinking really start to come together after these examples. Page 139, he says, good video games do more than order the situations and problems the player faces in an intelligent way. They also offer the player, in the early episodes, what I call a concentrated sample. By this I mean they concentrate in the early parts of the game an ample number of the most fundamental or basic artifacts, skills, and tools the player needs to learn. Seed the prior knowledge, right? Page 140, what all this means is that good video games have a special way of dealing with what we call in school the basics. Gives new light to the notion of testing for basic skills, doesn't it? And we need this structure because, after all, as he says on page 141, leaving children to the mercies of the real world by just letting them loose to think and explore is not education. Right? That's not explicit teaching. And the chapter concludes with learning principles 23 through 29 on pages 141 to 142. Switching to chapter 6. As the title implies, whenever we take the thinking out of the classroom level sphere, we take it up a notch. And this one takes it into a larger sphere. When players take on identities within the world of video games, page 145, he says, on the one hand, their presupposed perspectives on the world might be reinforced, but on the other hand, through their creation of new and different worlds and characters, video games can challenge players' taken for granted views about the world. Again, that's page 145. Good versus evil. Of course, video games are just as easy to design to allow you to play as a sinner as a saint, on page 147. Intriguing point to ponder right there. He offers two different models of what counts as being good. On one model, this is page 148, determined by a character's own goals, purpose, values, as these are shared with a particular social group to which he or she belongs. And the other is determined by the values and norms of a wider society that contains multiple, sometimes competing, groups, as well as more or less generalized rules and principles about behavior. That's page 148. What does he mean by models? Clarifies that as well on page 148. Not philosophical positions on ethics or theological ones on morality. Models are just everyday people's conceptions. Everyday people's conceptions, right? In other words, we all shape these models, everybody together, normal people. And in case that wasn't interesting enough, page 149, he says, these models regularly come into conflict in real life and cause all sorts of interesting issues and questions to arise. These are his cultural models, but just to keep things still further interesting. Page 150, since cultural models are usually not conscious for people, and since people rarely, if ever, try to formulate them definitively and once and for all in words, there is no exactly right way to phrase them. He notes on page 150 as well, social groups do not usually pay much overt attention to their cultural models unless one is threatened. And he offers a fascinating, if not provocative, array of cultural models in his discussion throughout page 150 to 155. Ultimately, they exist in context, and they exist with purpose. Even if we're not consciously aware of the purpose, and that purpose can be good or bad in those cultural models, right? I think he addresses violence in video games as well. I think he addresses it well in his Under Ash and Operation Flashpoint examples, which span page 155 to 166. Also, some intriguing models based on cultural models based on warfare on pages 165 to 166. In contrast, I hope the cultural models in school settings seem familiar, page 166 to 171. And on 171, where he says, nonetheless, if you've gotten this far in the book, you know that I believe cultural models are in many situations unfortunate models of learning. However, if students are to adopt different models of content learning in schools, teachers need to know that these unfortunate models exist. Students need to think about them, why they have them, where they do and do not work, and why they might want to adopt new and different models in word and deed. That's a call for change right there. That is a call for pedagogical change in our system. Also on page 171, ultimately, good video games have a powerful way of making players consciously aware of some of their previously assumed cultural models about learning. Traditional models in schools are linear. They emphasize moving from one skill to the next skill once you've mastered the previous skills, right? And they're competitive. G says that video games, on page 174, stress both nonlinear movement as well as linear movement and stress multiple solutions judged by a variety of different standards. So I kind of like that he's shaking up some pedagogy a little bit there. Page 30 to 30, learning principles 30 to 32 are then on page 176 to 177. So to jump into chapter 7. Research methodology. He shares a little bit of thinking with us about how he and his research assistants interviewed game players, which is great to see. Very interesting on page 182, where he says, as our society becomes ever more segregated by race and class, as people spend more and more time with people like themselves in terms of values and lifestyle, games like World of Warcraft become new public spheres. Very intriguing notion to think of a collaborative online gaming platform as crossing boundaries like that. Amazing example of Adrian from EverQuest on page 183 to 187. Great little case study example. It's pretty raw text. He reminds us on page 189 that he argued that human beings think and reason in terms of patterns they've picked up from their experiences in the world, and that thus we can think of a pattern in the mind as a set of nodes, which are linked to each other through stronger or weaker links or association. That notion of nodes is pretty important in how he talks about larger spheres of thinking and knowledge building. He walks us through, not unlike how cultural models are good or bad, how pattern thinking is very powerful and it allows us to think and reason using the experiences we have in life on page 190. It allows us to make guesses, predictions. On the one hand, we could not survive and function if we did not engage in such pattern thinking. But on the other hand, such pattern thinking can lead not only to good predictions in many cases, but also can lead to prejudices and stereotypes in other situations. So, pattern thinking does have its ills. Bird watching on page 192 to 196. This is a vintage piece of G that has its origins in his early 1990s work. And we arrive at his notion of distributed knowledge, page 196. So thinking and reasoning are inherently social, but they are also inherently distributed, and more so in our modern technological world. By this I mean that each of us lets other people and various tools and technologies do some of our thinking for us. Pretty interesting notion there. Further, on page 197, he says, the power of distribution, of storing knowledge in other people, text, tools, and technologies, is really the way all these things are networked together. The really important knowledge is in the network, that is, in the people, in their texts, their tools, their technologies, and crucially, the ways in which they are interconnected, not in any one node, but in the network as a whole. I like his little crack. He takes it himself again on page 202. He says, as an old baby boomer, you might think he has little knowledge of gaming, ultimately. But he is his own node in the network, and he has access to the whole network itself, right? Making him better than your original estimate would have assumed. It's pretty interesting. The science in the classroom example, pages 203 to 208. I hope that seems familiar pedagogically, especially to some of you, those of you who teach math and science. The 6 features of an affinity group in this context, on page 206 to 207, it connects very well with previous content. Further, on page 207, he says, in such affinity groups, people are committed through their immersion and practice, since it is the practice itself that gives them their identity and not some occupation, fixed set of skills or culture apart from the practice. Again, that's page 207. Page 208. Good video games allow players to be not just passive consumers, but also active producers who can customize their own learning experience. When he discusses fan-modified extensions to gaming, or mods, I think we are clearly talking about remix in the context of G's text on gaming and learning. Fascinating. And the chapter concludes with the final principles 33 through 36 on pages 211 to 212. Chapter 8. The argument, he says on page 215 to 216, the argument in this book is not what people are learning when they are playing video... Let me start over. The argument in this book is not that what people are learning when they are playing video games is always good. Rather, what they are doing when they are playing good video games is often good learning. Great thing to keep in mind, page 215 to 216. This chapter is obviously a very short conclusion to the book, relatively speaking, but it's a great recap of the reasons why he wrote this book and why it exists. That spans page 216 to 219. Some great summary of our previous chapters. And what a great final word on page 219. He says, I may well have learned more by writing this book than anyone has by reading it. Well, not counting the A-State New Literacies class in the EDS program, right, who's had just as much fun reading it. And it never hurts to take another peek at the appendix on pages 221 to 227, which lists and defines all 36 learning principles. It's a great go-to. It's a great little spot to have bookmarked. So hope you enjoyed bringing the book to a close, jumping into the article to accompany this week real quick. Welcome to our virtual worlds. This is a great article. It's short. It's got some punch, though. Very practitioner friendly. Layout looks great. He offers on page 49 of the article a crucial first step in promoting student engagement that should, I think, encapsulate much of the point of new literacies so far in the course. The What Students Stand to Gain section. It's a powerful one. It's got some punch. He says they'll find a wide-ranging, sturdy vocabulary of complex words in SimCity. Love the SimCity example from that. And in it, they take on situated meanings, that is, meanings associated with actions and images. The role of teachers changes when they use meaningful digital media for learning in meaningful ways. Again, that's also page 50 of the article. And there's sort of meaningful learning in meaningful ways. There's sort of an echo of Lancashire Nobel, right? New things in new ways. There's kind of a mindset, second mindset, kind of flow to G's language right there. Now thinking back to his book, the essential 21st century skills section in the article, it kicks off really well on page 50 of the article, where he says, our innovation-based global age requires us to retool foundational literacy skills and link them with other competencies, such as critical thinking, collaborative problem solving, and media literacy. Digital media enable students to practice these competencies in virtual worlds. Through games or player-built worlds, learners see how language is used in those worlds. They also learn how to use that language and other symbol systems, such as those in math and science, to solve authentic problems. That passage right there, I think, encapsulates a lot of G's text. And the What Teachers Need to Know section, page 51 of the article, G says that they know they must transform their classrooms and their teaching, but like the students they serve, they need scaffolding to change and grow. So he then sounds the call for appropriate forms of professional development that will move this thinking in the right direction, which is a great tone of advocacy, in my opinion, and great to see that. So I hope you've enjoyed the rest of your journey with Jim G and his thinking. I hope it's been a intriguing, possibly a little frustrating, but hopefully fascinating new direction in academic thinking for you. I hope you'll remember it as a key experience in your EDS journey. I really hope so. So again, I'll have an additional video to follow this with further support for your practitioner project short paper. And as always, make sure you are reaching out via your A-State email with those questions. Wolves up, and we'll see you in the final module next week.